It actually veered positive. So if you remove the friction, people will give more feedback than negative feedback. And it's a really big insight, because think about how much brands pay to acquire names. I mean, it's kind of absurd. Like, e-commerce agencies, they'll charge like, $50 to acquire a name, and they'll do everything. They'll carpet bomb the world to get like 1 out of 1,000 to click. And yet very few of them like ask for feedback. And I would say feedback is the best currency for relationship marketing. Do you like us or not? And the ability to kind of get the name that way is huge, even if you're not like buying the product yet. And so that was like the big aha, that it wasn't just that you were getting positive feedback, you were kind of creating a new gateway to building a relationship. But brands have to have that mindset.
Welcome back to Generation Influence, a podcast focusing on the movers and shakers working behind the scenes in influencer marketing, e-commerce, and brand management. I'm your host, Bill Hildebolt, one of the co-founders of gen.video, a leading platform in the influencer marketing space focused on advanced analytics and e-commerce outcomes. We are doing something very different today. My guest is Pete Blackshaw, who is someone everyone should be following and who I've had the pleasure of knowing for 23 years. Definitely dates us both, but it is what it is. Who is Pete Blackshaw? He was the first head of digital and internet at P&G. He then started a company called Planet Feedback, which literally might have been the first company 100% committed to user-generated content as a business model. I was on that board, and even I thought he was mildly insane at the time. Happily, it all worked out great for the company, the investors, and Pete. And then 3 years later, I had my own startup built on user-generated content where Pete served on my board, and I really built my career on the things that Pete taught me. He went on to head digital at Nestlé, and then 5 years ago, he returned to Cincinnati to lead Cintrifuse, which is essentially a startup incubator at ground zero for consumer packaged goods. So listen, folks, let me tell you, get your notebooks out, because this guy is like listening to the Oracle. I only understand about a third of what he says, and I frequently wake up in the middle of the night 10 years later and go, shit, now I see it. Let me get on that idea Pete had. In short, Pete's probably had more impact on my career than anyone else in the world. And if you let him, he's going to impact your career in this podcast. So Pete, if I missed anything, feel free to fill in the blanks. But otherwise, let's get into it. What do brand managers need to be thinking about right now? What are the themes that you are most excited about? Because I know there's a long list of things you are excited about. So most excited about.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for the generous introduction. It's fantastic to reconnect. And I think you're far too modest. I probably picked up a lot of my best digital skills from your good counsel. I think it's funny when you look back on your experience in startups, you kind of remember your first customer, and they almost treat them like God, even though if it's like $1 that they spent, just having that first customer. And then, those trusted board members, it's hard to, running a company, surviving a .com crash, those things are just really, really hard. And like advisors, mentors, psychologists, whatever you want to call it, are really important. Well, I've been thinking about brands my entire career, and I've built many different types of brands, starting with when I went to UC Santa Cruz, and I paid my way through school, developing a logo and a brand around our iconoclastic mascot, the banana slug, a design that ultimately made its way into Pulp Fiction. And, brand is a promise. It's, it's an identity and kind of keeping it pure and consistent, even if it's goofy and iconoclastic, is kind of the art of brand management. And so, and then of course I did more formal brand management at Procter & Gamble, working on brands like Bounty and helped launch Bounty napkins. And then I worked on a product called, helped launch a product called Impress Wrap that ultimately became, I think it's now called Press and Seal, through a joint venture with Clorox. And then, did a lot of work in the In the digital space, which I think really extends the brand promise, it starts to extend the brand into being more of a service proposition. And I think it kind of raises the bar, right? It's not enough to just deliver a physical product. You got to answer the phone, you got to manage the channels, and you need to do it consistently. You have to do it authentically. And to some extent, like that bar just kind of keeps going up. And when I did planetfeedback.com, that was kind of a recognition that the expectations of brands today are they're much greater than meets the eye, and they're pretty viral too. Like if you elicit the positive or the negative response, and and the book that I wrote with Doubleday was called Satisfied Customers Tell 3 Friends, Angry Customers Tell 3,000. And that was really about both the upside and the ugly downside of brand management, right? I mean, the brands that manage the promise well and even surprise and delight get the extra dividends, which are magnified in some cases more than even the media impressions you can buy on TV. And then on the negative side, it can be brutal. And that was probably the biggest thing that I learned when I took the job as global head of digital at Nestlé. A lot of what created that job, what created that position, not a manager of digital, not a director of digital, but a vice president of digital, was a bit of a come to Jesus moment where the online consumers were really taking Nestlé to task on supply chain issues, sourcing products, alleged slave labor. I mean, all sorts of issues, but it was the internet that kind of brought it to life. It was typing in the brand and then immediately defaulting to Wikipedia and finding out that 40% of Nestlé's reputation was dictated by stories about activists, which can immediately corrupt an unsuspecting consumer's mind. And so those were kind of early warnings to me that, the ball game in brand management is completely different. It's not just about promoting the brand. It's also about defending the brand. It's also about making the proper investments in things that we typically consider cost centers like customer service, but recognizing that those things will pay massive dividends over time. But you have to have a little bit of a long-term mindset. It's not like I'm buying an ad today, I'm getting a click 5 minutes later. It's just a trickier proposition. And what I think is interesting today, we're fast forwarding today, is I think we're entering some really complicated territory for brands. I think we're mostly reading about some of the benefits. Oh my gosh, I can get an agency on the cheap. I can now, use ChatGPT to turn a slogan into a poem for free. But the bigger issue is that these tools are allowing consumers, retailers, and others to really get behind the brand to find out whether there's substance behind the claim. Are they truly sustainable? Do they believe in diversity? Are they trustworthy? Is there real value? And those are going to be tough issues for brand managers to deal with. And so I've been thinking a lot about this theme. I'll pause right there in case you want to drill down on anything, but I could go forever on this theme.
I want to bring to the fore, I'm going to bring to the fore some of the core tenets that I think you've touched on that again, I'm more familiar with because we've worked together for so long, that I just want to hammer home for the audience. I mean, so first of all, I think origin stories are interesting, right? And so actually, as I recall, this is even pre-business school, you were in public service, like essentially in politics, right? And so
yeah,
the first thing you learned coming out of college. Yes.
That was my first brand management
kind of started
experience.
with this advocacy, and needing to understand, public perception and, being able to defend, what the people you represented in politics, right, stood for. And you then translated that, into this concept of the brand promise, which I don't know if you stole that or that's your original, thinking, but again, not a lot of people walk around talking about the brand promise. And that brand promise, by the way, which is sort of endemic to it, is this idea of authenticity and transparency. Because one of the things you hammered into me early on, to the point where it just became simple and intuitive, was, listen, consumers don't expect you to be perfect, but they do expect you to be transparent. And the moment that they perceive that you have lied to them or misled them, game over, you're dead. And frankly, it's the same lesson that we learn on the playground as children, but you do have to treat the brand like through the same emotional lens, if you want to succeed. The other thing I think is, again, so fascinating that was a learning for us was the idea when you started playing in feedback, right? The name feedback, right, implied that what we were going to help unleash but ultimately solve was a lot of consumer frustration with brands, because that's what brands understood at the time. Consumer feedback was negative because the barriers were so high. But what we didn't appreciate was that once you
Exactly.
lowered the barriers, i.e. the tool became more powerful and more efficient, actually it could go either way. So the most shocking moment, yes,
It
the
actually
most,
veered positive. So if you remove the friction, people will give more feedback than negative feedback. And it's a really big insight, because think about how much brands pay to acquire names. I mean, it's kind of absurd. Like, e-commerce agencies, they'll charge like, $50 to acquire a name, and they'll do everything. They'll carpet bomb the world to get like 1 out of 1,000 to click. And yet very few of them like ask for feedback. And I would say feedback is the best currency for relationship marketing. Do you like us or not? And the ability to kind of get the name that way is huge, even if you're not like buying the product yet. And so that was like the big aha, that it wasn't just that you were getting positive feedback, you were kind of creating a new gateway to building a relationship. But brands have to have that mindset. Again, my big shtick was that, in my book, I said that customer service or consumer affairs was the neglected stepchild in the organization. It was typically managed by IT organizations who are 100% incented based on less time on the phone, fewer phone calls overall. So you'd end up almost going, you do everything you could to kind of get the consumer to avoid having that interaction. And that was kind of those were bad practices. And that would almost like lead to, big missed opportunities. But you almost had to treat that as part of the marketing toolkit. Now, I do think, in fairness, the e-commerce industry has been fairly progressive. There's some aspects of e-commerce that still drive me nuts, like the extreme side of performance marketing. But I think they also recognize that reviews are what butter their bread, and so you have to get that love. And I think there's more filters to make sure that it's not shills, that it's authentic. So they have to do a certain amount of work in respecting the consumer's voice to kind of get those favorable reviews. And if they get those favorable reviews, it can work magic on selling product.
as these tools get more powerful and they get more sensitive, right, the opportunity for that energy to go explode in the wrong direction is equally as powerful as it is to explode in a good direction. And so it is about harnessing the energy, understanding the tools, and sticking to that principle of transparency and authenticity. And so one thing that I do think is interesting is, when we first started down this path, and we were both working in the UGC world, all day long, the continuous message was to the brands, you've lost control of the brand. The brand is now owned by the consumer. Get used to it. And there was a lot of resistance to that. And I would actually say that has turned out in many ways very well. And today's brand manager, I find our clients are exceedingly open to the idea of allowing influencers, almost too much, allowing influencers to tell the story for them, right? That they allow them to be very unscripted. I mean, this idea that, that influencers, are paid to read scripts is not true. Certainly not the way we execute, and not because we're telling clients it's a bad idea, but because clients are like, well, geez, they're influencers. They probably know, the brand and what consumers want to hear better than we do. And I'm like, wait, that's our line. And so I do think brands are primed to embrace the next evolution in where this goes. But that is not to say, to your point, that if you lose sight of those first principles of transparency, authenticity, and sincere engagement, that you aren't going to blow yourself sky high, with the powerful new tools and the ability for people to do research that's out there. So kind of one of the takeaways I take, that I hear you saying is there's no hiding And so don't even bother trying to hide. Embrace your reality and figure out how to turn the energy that consumers are going to bring to that question, into a positive way, in a way that's going to work for, again, for you and for the brand, approaching it sincerely.
And it's not rocket science. I mean, a lot of this is just like old fashioned basics, like do what you say, treat the customer with respect, educate them where appropriate, ensure your messaging is delivered in the channels in which they're most receptive. I mean, they're just like basics. It's not like scientific digital stuff, but you get rewarded, like respond to the consumer. Like when I wrote the book, I talked about the 6 drivers of brand credibility: trust, transparency, authenticity, listening, engaging, and affirmation. And kind of the affirmation was the interesting one, because that's where you type in gen.video or Pete Blackshaw or Tide into Google or any search engine, or now ChatGPT, and either you're affirmed or you're not. I'd often say your brand standing is your shelf landing, right? Again, it goes back to that. You type in Nestle and you suddenly get it barks back the boycott from the 70s. And so it just destabilizes, or it says, it's the most lovable brand on the planet. And so you've got to win on all fronts. Now, the good news, they feed into each other. The authentic voice often goes viral, and then that can impact the search algorithms. Trust is very, very viral on both sides of the equation. But yeah, these are just the new rules. And again, I haven't completely organized my thinking on this yet, but I just think there's going to be a lot of tricky stuff that emerges around, AI. And my advice on that is consistent. I'd say a bit of a repeat of like the Planet Feedback era, like it always pays to listen. So I think brands really need to know their standing in the world of AI. Are they being punished? Are they being rewarded? And you need to know how you stand relative to competition. And then I think you need to take a step back and say, okay, what is it that actually influenced those results? And is it something that, I can shift? And you may realize that to really change that black box isn't going to be as easy as the old world of Google search, where you could buy advertising around the negative, or you could try to manipulate link love. I think the AI is going to be a heck of a lot more tricky. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of agencies that pop up, SEO equivalent of, but it's not, remember, like Microsoft spent, what was it, $10 billion for the AI algorithm. Essentially, they bought the black box secret sauce. And I'm telling you, it's going to be really, really, you can't just simply re-engineer that. I think it's going to be really tricky, and brands are going to have to really make some smart assumptions about what's feeding that. And a lot of these things that we've talked about, like great customer service, living your brand promise, are going to figure heavily into this.
That is super interesting, super helpful.
How am I doing?
Let's double click into that AI side of things, because obviously it is topic du jour. I know you're spending a lot of time personally thinking about it and playing with it. Can you describe the process of how you are personally using ChatGPT now? I do think there's this perception that maybe it's just a vastly improved Google, where you can ask it not just a question, but you can ask it to do a task and bam, it's done. That's not right, of course. And so I feel like your process is really easy to conceptualize for those who are still trying to get started. And so let's start there.
You've heard me say this a million times. I'm a big believer in trusting your inner consumer, and it's your inner consumer that kind of powers your insight around how you apply it to business and brand management. And so I would just say, this is Socrates in your pocket, and so who can't get excited about playing with that? And it's fun, and it's kind of remarkable what it's coming up with. Yes, there's probably some inaccuracies, but the inaccuracies you complain about today are gone by tomorrow. That's just how fast the learning curve is. And so my advice is just find the sweet spot that just ignites your curiosity. Maybe I'm a geek, but Wikipedia is one of the most popular sites on the web, partly because people like to just learn, and so you can learn really, and then you can have a dialogue. I do think this notion of like preserving the interaction, the stream, and it keeps getting smarter over time. And I've really had a lot of fun with that. I'm obviously doing a lot of editing, but it's fun. Like if you sort of say, cut the content by 15%, add a little bit more sarcasm, take out this point. Can you add a little bit more of this or that? It's kind of remarkable how it cranks stuff out. Going back to my point about your inner consumer, I mean, this may sound a little bit absurd, but and I'm sure my employees think I'm a crazy man, but I have probably written 1,000 poems. I mean, I'm just like, I've always been a big believer that, you just gotta, advertising or messaging needs to be attractive and rewarding. And I've gotten really good at prompt engineering, and whether it's for a family member or for my team, I'm like typing things in and I'm kind of putting it on Slack for the team, or I'm kind of sending it to my family. And I guarantee you, I'm getting like 5 times the click through. It's just a lot more interesting. And I always sign it like Pete GVT. So I'm not trying to profess that I've suddenly become Shakespeare, but it's still a hell of a lot more entertaining to read. But again, how do you turn it into, I've always believed like we should use these mediums to get a higher ROI in what we're already doing. And so I've always tried to say thank you to folks and acknowledge them. And, ChatGPT can help you do it in haiku or rhyme verse or in French. So be it. That's the fun part. That's not about plagiarism. That's about creative confidence. Like my creative confidence has gone up dramatically. I mean, and it's kind of working. Just yesterday, we got the big BA flight in Cincinnati. It was like a big watershed moment. British Airways is now doing a direct flight out of Cincinnati. Big news for startups, big news for businesses taking us seriously. So I went to a high tea event to celebrate it. And I took a bunch of photos and I posted on Facebook, but rather than saying, hey, I went to the high tea, I wrote a little love letter note to about how significant it was, and all sorts of influencers who never paid attention to my stuff liked it. And I was thinking, okay, I got a little help from ChatGPT. And so I would just say, think about those personal things that help you, because I think once you get rolling on the personal side, then you start to pick up a lot of tips really fast. Now I love compare and contrast. I've gotten really good at Google Bard. I've gotten really good. I'm doing all the stuff with Microsoft. I'm on a panel tomorrow with Microsoft about ChatGPT. I still think they're struggling a little bit with clutter. You can tell they're trying to preserve the old model, but add the new model on top. But the problem is when ChatGPT came out, we all got spoiled by radical simplicity and noise-free interfaces. So I think one of the challenges in the ad industry is going to be how do we permit advertising when we've all been spoiled for 6 months, which is really like 100 internet years, with noise-free searching with really good results. I think that's going to be a really big trick. Figuring that out. And then the other thing for me is I wrote an article in Ad Age in January. I was really almost addicted to this stuff, and during my winter break, but I was just captivated by it. But one of the things that quickly came into mind is that ChatGPT, and I wrote this article in Ad Age, basically said it's going to be the world's greatest bullshit detector for brands. And it's a greenwashing detector. Like the carbon analytics, everyone should write this down if they want to be either heroes in their job or to keep their job. The detail, the precision with which these AI algorithms understand your carbon footprint, your green footprint is remarkable. And it keeps getting better. And I would probably give the highest marks for Google Bard, which the industry really hasn't written about that much. You almost have to live it to start to inform some of your own assumptions. But Google Bard is really precise on carbon measurements. If you say, precisely how much energy will I save using Tide cold water versus regular Tide, they'll give you a carbon footprint. They'll give you a real precise number. If you say, okay, if I keep using it for the lifetime of my shopper behavior, what does that mean? And they'll immediately kind of calculate. But, this is going to have huge consequences because data and information that was impenetrably inaccessible, and a lot of brands made it that way. You go through this QR code or try to read the label on the back, and the consumer's like, forget it. Now you're like one click away from the truth that you care about. We all care about green. It's just that, it's easy to blow it off if it's hard to know what's really going on. And now it's like bubbling up. And so I think brands are going to have to really, really prepare for that world. And that, you've got this green Sputnik of innovation that's taking place on carbon analytics. And I think brands better wake up to that reality very quickly. And they got to defend their CEOs because their CEOs are going out there talking about ESG reports, which right now nobody reads except for maybe the policy set or the regulators. But now that data is kind of creeping out to consumers via search engines. And that's a really big deal. And it's not just consumers. Think about how retailers are going to make decisions over what brands get on shelf. I mean, every other word Walmart is saying sustainability, sustainability, sustainability. So now brands are kind of pushing their products. And now you've got AI, which is almost, again, it's kind of like, is it true or not? What's really behind the brand? And you can wait for the brand to kind of make their case, or you just use these tools and sort of say what's really behind the product. And even if it's not a perfect line to the truth, it certainly arms you with good questions to ask the brand.
One of the things I love about, there's so many things to unpack there, but one of the things I love about this line of thinking is, right, everyone is so worried about deep fakes and, and actually being misled by artificial intelligence here and in our, previous kind of conversation getting ready to do the podcast. We talked a lot about how actually, if you think about it, one of the things that AI was likely to do is help you detect the fakes. And it sort of brought to mind the analogy of, right, the radar detector. First, the police had the radar detector and we all got speeding tickets. Then we all got radar detectors that could detect the radar that the police had. Then the police got the radar detector that could detect that we had a radar detector. And so, it's this never-ending arms race. But what shines through that is this idea that actually it will create opportunities for AI to say, oh no, that's, your AI. Well, they like, oh no, that's fake. What's being presented to you there, that is, you're being manipulated. And so it actually can be as much a force for good as it's going to be a force for, for evil. And there will be this sort of never-ending arms race. But again, it comes back to your first principle of, let's just get on with the transparency and the authenticity. Because it's, again, it's back to kindergarten rules. As long as we're being fair and honest, like, things will work out. We'll win in the end. And so I love that. I love that idea. I actually think it's very hopeful. I do want to, but you've also talked there on another trend that again, I'm not sure every brand is as convinced of the centrality of this moving forward as I'm seeing it in consumers and the reactions of, viewers to influencer content in the space is sustainability, right? This has just become such a core central theme. And so is there anything beyond, again, being transparent and authentic, and obviously trying to clean up issues where they exist, or at least getting, to benchmark in your industry and then pushing the innovation? Are there other things brands should be thinking about down the sustainability path that you're seeing or that you believe are about to kind of hit?
Yeah, well, I mean, first off, it goes back, know your vulnerabilities. And I just think and accept the fact that the vulnerability that you think is not maybe preventing you from selling cases probably will in this world of friction-free radical transparency. And then I think there's, I think there's a lot of, as you look at I think some of it goes back to the old stuff I did with Planet Feedback. I mean, we got, we would do, $1 million deals with companies that wanted to monitor the buzz related to what people were saying about them. And, it's really important to kind of understand just how much consumers care about that issue. And it's for all the bad talk about TikTok, I think a lot of that's warranted, but TikTok's also a great focus group into the green movement. And, it's funny, and I'll talk to brands that'll high five themselves because they got 200 likes on LinkedIn on their sustainability post. And you go to TikTok and there's some 16-year-old who's taking down a brand because they're using plastic for their beauty care dispenser and they're getting 30 million views. I mean, they're just ungodly amounts of audience that it's like, how could that possibly be? And I just think brands really need to read that memo and understand. I think plastics is going to be a major issue. It already is. Even when I went to Nestle, I got to know the CEO, Mark Snyder, really well. And he, I remember one of the first things he said is what the hell are we going to do about plastics? And it was only a few months after I left that he actually sold the entire North American waters business, which was probably the biggest plastic purveyor on the planet. They kept Perrier and Pellegrino, the premium ones, but the big volume ones, it was goodbye, because they were being blamed for the California water crisis. I mean, it was and I think those issues are going to get really even more complicated. Single-use plastics. I think there's a big movement to, and we're part of that. We're trying to help brands hack that, but I think that's going to be a big vulnerability issue. Again, as these metrics get more precise, brands are going to be close to it. Now, I do think there's a whole new ad space that can emerge around green storytelling. I think that's a great area. And the reason why I love that is, again, this is a little bit more on the positive side. I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer on these issues, but when I was at Nestle, I was in charge of the Silicon Valley Innovation Outpost, and we did hundreds of tests with kind of new technologies and enablers with the brands. And what was interesting about all the stuff that we did with AR and VR and all the immersive technologies is that the best output always came from the brands that had a green story, because you could just take the consumer to really interesting places. So Nespresso, for example, was planting cameras in the fields in Costa Rica where the consumer could go to the website and take a look at it. But it's just a much richer storytelling canvas. So I've talked a lot about the vulnerability side, but on the positive side, I think there's a whole new ad space. But we're going to think differently about what advertising is. It's going to have to be really, it's going to be grounded in authenticity, maybe a deeper, more immersive storytelling. And I think a lot of brands are going to really win on that front. And so I think, you're going to, that's an opportunity totally on the positive side.
We've definitely seen in the programs that we've run on the influencer side that have a sustainability angle, they always outperform, almost shockingly to me. It's an issue people care about. And and again, I think in this sort of capitalistic world, we talk a lot about the trade-offs. I actually don't see a trade-off, with sustainability. Sustainability is a good that we can consume like any others. And again, in a world where, we are capable, we may not do a great job distributing food and wealth to everyone, but we are more than capable of creating plenty of food and plenty of warmth and decent living standards for everyone on the planet. And so beyond that, it's a choice of what we consume, and we can consume sustainability. It will create jobs. It will create opportunity, it will create innovation, it will create income and growth, and we just have to lean into it.
Well, I think it'll just get you new audiences too. Again, everybody has to win with the new consumers, and this is table stakes for them. My daughter, 17-year-old, she is, I'd say she's pretty mainstream, but she's she's really into the green movement, and she's really into Formula One. She's like a super fan of Formula One. She could tell you any statistic about any driver, but she started a Twitter account called Net Zero Grand Prix, and she's critiquing the industry on their sustainability practices. And she's post, they'll Formula One will put out some green document. She's critiquing it. She's dialoguing with drivers or whoever. But that's today's consumer, and there's nothing is sacred. Even Formula One, and so I think you just got to build that into your assumption in terms of how you win with these new audiences. But the good news for brand managers, going back full circle, is that, this is, I think this potentially makes the profession, the role, a lot more interesting. I just think it really opens up, again, a bigger, more meaningful canvas and value creation. And I think the brands that kind of do this right are going to just see massive
actually,
rewards.
As you were speaking, I could actually see it opening up the brand manager role, because it does move from like, okay, well, you're in charge of this very narrow brand story that we want to tell, to no, you are actually a steward of the overall identity of the brand, and everything from, the original product conception through the creation, through how that's translated to the consumer. So no, I love that. That is a very hopeful message. And actually, you talked about your daughter, and so that seems like a perfect segue to one of the things I wanted to move over, which is that you have very much straddled the world between brand and startups. And, you've worked with as many startups, in fact, more probably than a lot of VCs. And so, you said something to me recently that was really interesting, that even the youngest founders generally nail the insight. And that stuck with me. And I wanted to ask you, it obviously stuck with you because you wouldn't have said it to me otherwise. How is that possible to your mind? Like what makes that possible, that, the most inexperienced people who probably haven't worked in brand marketing, by definition, doing a first startup, probably still in college, are nailing the insight? And how are they able to see these things that sometimes, the rest of us with all of our experience and expertise are just missing?
Well, again, there's two different buckets. There's kind of nailing the insight, and then there's kind of capability to run the business. And I would say that a lot of the folks that are coming up with the best, most intuitive insight or spot on insight, maybe they're not qualified to kind of scale the business. They're probably good to kind of get it started, but yeah, listen, I ran a program called Entrepreneurs Change the World, and it was all high school and college kids. And I kid you not, like, we could have spent millions at Nestlé on traditional agencies, and we would not come close to the brilliance of these young kids. They're living it. They're breathing it. They speak TikTok. They speak Instagram. They're gamified. They're doing, they're on Twitch. I mean, we can't speak that language. I mean, an insight is all about, understanding the context in the world that you're in. And so, sometimes it may not even be that insightful. It's just that they're more relevant. They're in a much more relevant situation than we are. So, but yeah, I do think, like if you're trying to come up with the big green idea, or even things like, how do I overhaul my website? Yeah, I think speaking to these young consumers, and it's humbling because, I'm starting to feel really self-conscious about even how I do social media, and like I'm starting to feel a little dated. I'm kind of like ready to go hire some TikTokers to kind of reorient me to the world. But again, that's how you get the good insights today. And, you got it. And you have to bring, the other thing I would add to this discussion about the future of brand management is I think we need to bring a whole different level of humility to our world. And it's, there's just like a different generation that's figuring things out, faster, better. On one hand, they don't have process, but they do have process. Think about these TikTokers. They're like the world's best database marketers, but they would never call themselves that, and we always poke fun at social media, but they're running the numbers, they're test and learn. If a post isn't getting traction, they take it down before you even know that it went up. They know how to release it to their friends ahead of time to maybe get a little bit of an early lift. They're very good at saying thank you to everybody who posts something meaningful. So it kind of keeps the meme going, and it's just intuitive. That's how they breathe. We need 1 million fact books in multiple layers of agencies to get that right. I hate to be so harsh on ourselves, but the truth will liberate us.
It's a great point. I think, you think about the power of AI, and you think about your daughter, and you think about that tool in her hands, which will be, very easy and native for her to pick up. And yeah, maybe your fears for us only get heightened, but your hope for the future only gets like increased. And so it's absolutely true. And it's funny that you put it in those terms where they don't even know they're doing it, right? They don't even know that it is a skill, but it is 100% a skill that's being employed, in the success that they have in social media.
I'm working on this concept called, because, again, what I do now is I kind of have this grocery store of services for startups and at whatever stage in the journey that you are. But, and I'm generally kind of a cheerleader for everybody who walks through the door. But speaking candidly, a lot of bad ideas come through the door. And so, it's always like, but I've been thinking about a different model, and I've been working on this business model called, almost like, for lack of a better word, like Idea Bank, where you take some of the brilliant concepts that come from the young people and you bottle them up, you validate them. Maybe you run it by some VCs and sort of say, if this became a business model, would you buy or would you invest? Or maybe you run it by some customers. And then you just put it on the shelf and let more experienced founders like grab it. You kind of protect some remuneration for the originator, the crazy college kid that just kind of came up with the idea. So there's a little bit of a flywheel of compensation. And then, so you could, and the nice thing about tools like ChatGPT, you can actually validate concepts, Def would buy, whatever it is. And then let those more experienced founders kind of like just take the products off the shelf and then take them to market. And if it's really successful, some type of like, but I just think there's an opportunity to really take, a lot of really good ideas and kind of put it into a marketplace. And that's kind of the direction that I'm starting to take, that I've been thinking a lot. I just got off the phone with a professor from University of Cincinnati who's also been thinking about the same idea, but just different ways of taking that brilliant insight from those very intuitive ideators that are kind of in touch with the world as it is, and then creating a marketplace for the folks that maybe have more business experience that can carry it forward. And I think it's a really bold idea. I'm trying to find ideas that really help our region, like make a mark, Atlanta's doing certain things with entrepreneurs very uniquely. Detroit, Pittsburgh's like owning AI, but maybe the area that we can own is this concept of the Idea Bank, where we're kind of like taking things that normally would sit on the cutting room floor and actually kind of giving it extra life.
You heard it here first. If you've got ideas for the Idea Bank, or you want to operationalize some things,
I know. Don't steal that idea.
Pete is the man. And it's funny.
I still have this crazy. I was going to say, people would think I'm crazy if they saw my list of domains that I own, but there are all these areas where, like I said, okay, I think I may want to go on this path. At least I'll protect the name, but then it's hard to give it up because you never know, right?
It's hard to give it up. All ideas are beautiful. It's funny. I love that you picked back up on that because, as you were saying, you were talking about the kids and that they have the insight, but they don't have the experience to operationalize. I was like, well, okay. I feel like there's a whole bunch of people out there, especially at the moment, right, who could do a pretty good job figuring out, is there a business model to be applied? Because, it might be a great idea that is just not business modelable, but most things are business modelable, and it's figuring out the fit.
Well, that's where AI can kind of close the last mile. So maybe where, because you can kind of take the concept and like write the business plan, map out a customer segment. I mean, you can do a lot to kind of that you normally would have to outsource to an expert, but now you can almost like take that brilliant concept and find out if it's really kind of, you can go a lot further. In fact, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is, like one discussion that people are not having about AI is just, could it be the great equalizer? And the reality, one of my big missions is to really dramatically, step change, startup growth from diverse founders. And what are the barriers? What's the friction? How do you de-risk it? The reality is that, a lot of founders just step out of line because, they've burned their bank account before they even have that first chance to really swing the bat before the VCs. And could tools like AI change that math where, and it's not like you don't have to spend any money. You always have to, there's always an opportunity cost. But could you help founders of all kind, but, just ideally, maybe changing the diversity, equation, and, use these tools to just help them, VC readiness. And I think that's a really big idea. And I think that's the way we should be thinking about this. I know there's a lot of dystopia, Terminator. I mean, I'm an urgent optimist by nature, so I'm not naive to where things can go south or negative, but I think it's our duty as leaders or as brand managers or as entrepreneurial custodians to help people see the positive upside in a lot of these tools. And I think there's a lot. And I think there's a lot of things we've been scratching our head over, getting mad about, beating ourselves up about, whether it's diversity and equity. And we may find that there's an acceleration strategy here. But we have, same thing in healthcare too. It's like, these tools could dramatically change the math of how we get healthcare services and potentially, finally, God willing, like lower the cost structure.
Yeah. I love that. There's, I remember another one of our board members early on at gen.video who served with you, right, would always ask the question, are you done twisting the knobs? And the answer was always, no, we're still twisting knobs, right? Trying to figure out what the right equation is. And, what people don't realize is the amount of, I'm going to call it energy and time waste in twisting the knobs. And if you could have, even some breadcrumbs, of a direction to go to cut through that inefficiency. And so, yes, if that could help more startups be successful and open the playing field to to all the brilliant ideas of people who just don't have the resources, like you said, to get out of the batter's box, that'd be a game changer. And I know the same is true, particularly in healthcare. There's no better industry where we haven't really even had knobs effectively for millennia. Well, this has been amazing. I will open it up to you if there's anything else you want to sort of bring up and chat about while you think about that. I do want to close out with something I hope you find fun. And as the audience has no doubt figured out, I've got you on my personal genius list. So go ahead and blush, but it's true. And so this week's fun question is, who is the smartest person you know? And the only rules here are that, one, it truly has to be someone you know. So this has been like in-your-face genius that you've experienced in real time, which is, again, is just we've all gone through it. It's an amazing thing when it happens. I've experienced it with you. And so I want to know who you've experienced it with, because that person is effing smart. And then the only other rule is they have to be alive, because otherwise we can't tell them about how cool you think they are.
Yeah, I can't say it's ChatGPT, my buddy Chatty.
They truly have to be sentient and a living, breathing person. But yeah, either open it up to other themes you want. If you want to, prevaricate and delay while you think about that question, we can chat about something else. Otherwise, who is Pete's genius?
Well, my classmate Sheryl Sandberg from HBS is wickedly sharp, and even way before she did all her amazing things on Facebook, and and that's just both intimidating and inspirational. Going back to business school, when I was at Nestlé, I was really impressed with Rob Norman's intellect. He was at that time kind of a work for mind share, but I would sometimes have to unpack his articles, multiple times just because they were so deep. More broadly, I got to think about that. I know there's like another one that's out there, but I'm serious. I actually have found that these AI tools to be kind of my new pocket genius. I mean, so I'm not saying that humans are losing, but I have found,
I love that. That is awesome.
A fun companion.
And I also want to say it's great. There's something very hopeful about an answer like Sheryl Sandberg, because she's obviously had the success to back up that genius claim, and it's great to see that happen, right? That people with those kind of capabilities can find their place in the world, and having, the impact she had, not just on Meta, but, on women in the workforce. And so that's an awesome one to hear. So, all right. And we're going to go look up Rob Norman, and we're going to make sure Rob knows that he's on your list. I'm sure he'll appreciate it as well.
He's funny. He's a crack up. He's got the British accent and just really, I mean, there's a side of the digital world that really intimidates me. I mean, it's multi-layered. It's, and just like, there's a small minority of folks who really kind of know what's going on. I can't wait to have a beer with him about ChatGPT. There's probably a few things about the black box he knows that I don't know.
Well, and that's the good thing is, part of the reason I ask you so many questions about it is we're all learning from each other, right? As much as we're learning from ChatGPT, we're learning from each other. Well, what did you do with it? Well, what did you do with that? And especially, for those of us in the, let's say over 40 set, that is going to be the way we keep up with the digital natives and don't get replaced anytime soon. So, well, Pete, this has been an awesome conversation. We want to thank you for being on the show.
It's great to reconnect. It's taken too long.
I know. We can't let that happen. And so everyone else, thanks for watching. If you have questions for Pete, definitely reach out. He is easily accessible and well worth the price of entry. So again, thanks, Pete. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next time on Generation Influence.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Generation Influence drop every Wednesday, so be sure to check us out and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. You can find information on next week's guest in the description below. Hope to see you then and there.